give an example of some of the work that we do, I think Mark's handing around some of our annual impact reports. So I'm a community worker for an organisation called Kingsway Community Connections, and it's our 25th anniversary this year. And I suppose to maybe give an example of some of the organisations that Mark's kind of talking about, kind of history of community health in Scotland. I'll go through just a little bit about us, kind of our approach, a bit of our history, and some of the challenges that we face as well. So we're kind of an old school, we were previously called a health and wellbeing centre, and we're kind of like place-based and community-led. So we exist at the bottom of a high-rise flats in the northwest of Glasgow, called the Kingsway Estate. It's a very kind of multicultural community. There's a website or something called the Scottish Index for Multiple Deprivation, which, the value of it. But basically what it suggests is that the communities that we work with are in the lower percentile, the most disadvantaged, or I think, Mark, you used the phrase, kind of sacrificed communities.
Sacrificed ones, basically.
Abandoned and kind of oppressed, basically. So we are fully grant funded, and I should say, in response to what Tony said as well, one of our biggest funders is the Scottish Government as well. So I know from kind of knowing Leanne and things like that, it's the argument about being kind of like in and against the state, or where you exist within that. But to be fully transparent, we are one of our biggest funders is Scottish Government, and the other one is Glasgow City Council as well. It's other funders as well. So we exist to improve the lives and the health and well-being of our community members, and we do that by taking a community development approach to health and well-being, which is kind of Mark has stated previously as well, is different from the medical model. So we focus in on two kind of main things, which is kind of what causes wellness, the kind of interests and aspirations and changes that people identify in themselves and in their community and come together to kind of develop, and then as well, I suppose, the kind of structural causes of poor health as well, and challenging discrimination and inequality and poverty and things like that. So yeah, we to do this, we've developed something that we call personal growth and wellness, which is our approach to, and there's a bit more detail in the book, but it's kind of our approach to supporting people through the design, delivery and evaluation of everything that we do. So rather than focusing on kind of outcomes that are kind of predetermined, we kind of look at how we can help people make positive changes in their lives. We encounter people at different parts of their lives with different circumstances, and it's just about building those relationships so that we can kind of see what actually interacting with our centre and the support and the kind of community and social connections that come with that actually achieve. And we focus in on specific things like people having a sense of more purpose and meaning in their lives, optimism, confidence, a sense of belonging. In terms of our history, there's been some really important moments in our history. 25 years ago, the area that we operate in was one of the biggest dispersal points for asylum seekers in Glasgow. And so in the kind of flats, when they were originally built in the 60s, they serviced a lot of people that were working in the shipyards, as Mark mentioned as well. And then there was a period of deindustrialisation, and there was a lot of poverty. And then there was suddenly quite a lot of families and people coming from other places and being housed in our area. So there were challenges, but there were also a lot of kind of opportunities within that as well. One of the biggest challenges, and I think one of the biggest moments, and it's probably how Mark partly became so connected with our organisation, was the anti-dawn raids campaign as well. So the Home Office would send vans round to the Kingsway flats and other flats in Glasgow very early in the morning, and they would detain and remove families. And the community that I wasn't there at the time, but the community that was there interacted with our organisation and kind of created a kind of action plan to stop this happening. So they said they don't want just members of our community, our friends and our neighbours, to just be detained and removed. So someone who is now in their 80s and still comes to our lunch club was one of the kind of key figures in this, and she, along with the rest of the community, put a practice in place where someone would see the vans, they would make a phone call to whoever was in the house, families would come and take the family away, put them in another house, and basically the Home Office would go home without being able to take families away. So it was a really important and I think foundational moment in Kingsway Community Connections identity and kind of the actual strength of the connections between our organisation and the community itself, and sense of what it's for and what people want our community or organisation to be for them and how they interact with it. So that was a really important moment, and it kind of also opened doors for more work around kind of integration and kind of celebration of kind of multicultural nature of the community. So we had things like the Kingsland Carnival, where we would connect with another local high-rise kind of estate, and there would be a march from that estate to ours, and we would kind of close the roads down and things like that. Unfortunately, we can't do that anymore because it's so difficult due to health and safety, Glasgow City Council, various barriers. But that was a really important moment. Some of the groups that have local community members who have come and kind of interacted with our organisation and then kind of taken some ownership and responsibility within it includes the Kurdish Women's Group, who I think first started in 2012. Started as a group of Kurdish women in the community who kind of started using the centre to kind of socialise and have activities, and is now growing to be like over 100 people every week coming from not just our area but all over Glasgow and other surrounding areas to take part in different health and well-being and creative activities, as well as the Tamil language group. And just recently, one of our board members who first came to a litter pick and then came to a mapping project and then joined the board, she is now delivering a Sudanese women's group as well. So I mean, again, another opportunity to kind of connect with other community members, which has been fantastic and is really the most important thing that I think that's happened in the last few months for us. In terms of the challenges, I would say that the nature of funding, the short-term nature of the funding, the competitive nature of the funding, despite the fact that we've been here for 25 years, it could be that we don't exist after March if more funding doesn't open up, and that's just the case on a kind of habitual reality for us and other organisations. And as much as we always look for opportunities for partnership working, people are so busy, they're all competing for the same funding, it makes it really difficult, which makes the HMS so fundamentally kind of important to us as an organisation, as also to me as an individual, because obviously I come here and I'm not funded by the Scottish Government, but Kingsway Community Connections is by the Scottish Government. So I suppose it's another opportunity that way as well. Again, all the other kind of everything that kind of all the sense of injustice and inequality in society also impacts us. So we recently had a young 9-year-old boy from a migrant background come and tell us about some racist graffiti that was on the wall that they'd seen on their way to school, and that opened up discussion, but it was also just an indication that the rise of the far right, the rise in violence and the rise in racism obviously impacts us as well. So that's clearly one of the biggest challenges. And yes, I was just going to say as well that in terms of how kind of being flexible and adaptable to try and respond to what we're actually being told and what we're actually seeing within our community. One of the biggest things, changes recently, is more focus on youth work. So unfortunately, earlier this year, a member of our youth group died in violent circumstances. And we felt very isolated and alone, as well as the community. You know, we opened up our space, and the family came to our community centre to mourn. And we had a vigil, but we were reaching out for support from statutory services, from police, from schools, to share information, to try and work out how best to support the community in respond to this. And it was really difficult and really isolating, and it made it really obvious that we were very disconnected. We connected with another organisation from London who have been really useful. They experienced something similar 5 years ago, and they put into practice a really effective partnership working with other community organisations and statutory services in their area of London. And it really made us think, you know, we need to be prepared to support the community. This could absolutely happen again. There's clearly a rise in violence affecting young people, and that's what the young people are telling us, that they don't feel safe in their community. Obviously, youth services have been decimated from austerity as well. So we are kind of trying to pivot at the moment, and we're a small team. There's only kind of 5 main members of staff. There's only myself and another colleague who are actually part of the kind of community development program team, but we're trying to kind of open ourselves up and find more money to support young people in our area. So I suppose that was a challenge, but also an example of how we try and kind of respond to issues that emerge in our community.
Thank you. So just before asking you for kind of questions, because for us it'd be really interesting to know the kind of context from where you are, if you have similar type of approaches, if you I know you'll have similar problems, but what the approaches are. So this gives you an idea. So this is the Kingsway in the middle here, and these are different funders, okay? So, and it is kind of all a bit kind of messy because you know, the funding really goes from Scottish Government to City Council. And then City Council is also part of what they call a partnership, which is kind of linked into the health boards. So there are, you know, wheels within wheels in terms of, now, one of the biggest grant-making organisations in Scotland is called the Robertson Trust. Can you have a guess at where the money might come from?
Pharmaceutical companies.
Hmm?
Pharmaceutical companies.
No.
What's one of Scotland's favourite pastimes?
Well, some of you might have been doing it. I was certainly doing it last night. Alcohol.
Oh, wow.
Right. Okay, so the Robertson Trust was set up by sisters who are part of the, I think, called the Edington Group, which is a big distillery in Drumchapel, the link back, but also kind of has like the famous grouse and all these different kind of drinks lines. So as the communities get poorer, the alcohol companies get richer, and some of that money finds its way back into the communities. But it is, they have tried to target poverty, etc., as with their funding. So, I'm not trying to be overcritical of them, but it is indicative. The other thing is
the lottery.
Yeah, the lottery. So, fingers crossed. Where does the majority of the money come from? The lottery? It's from the poorest communities. So those are the people who are buying the tickets.
And we also people keep coming in and suggesting we go to the AA systems as well.
Yeah.
So we've got a big.
Do you want to say what the AA system?
I forget. So what's the stand for? British Engineering Aerospace or something like that? Basically, BAE is one of the biggest arms manufacturers in the world. It was certainly the biggest UK, but also had a global. It got one of the largest fines for corruption ever about 10 years ago, but that didn't seem to kind of really make a dent in the profits. But if you had driven past the Clyde, you'll see there's a great big warship there at the moment getting kind of refitted. So BAE Systems still sits on the Clyde, and as I say, you know, there was a moral, issue with many of the people. Oh, the money is there, they don't want to take it because of the ethics involved. This organisation here is called Inspiring Scotland, and they're what the Scottish Government does to kind of set up a sort of arm's length people so they can't be then criticised for who gets funding and who doesn't get funding. So it can become, they call it the kind of poverty industry sometimes, this kind of all these networks. But this one I wanted to speak to you about because it's called Weekly Homes, or the Weekly Group. And one of the big things that happened that we've not really spoken about in Glasgow was Glasgow used to have, you know, municipal housing. So basically it was social housing that was run by the city. And 25, in that kind of region about 25 years ago, basically there was a vote amongst those. So, and the sweetener was, so this is neoliberalism, you know, red in tooth and claw. The sweetener was the housing was in a huge amount of debt, but if you as a tenant voted to go to a housing association instead of being run by the council, that debt was going to be written off. Okay, so I can't remember what the percentage was, but basically it got passed that the housing went to these housing associations. It was a thing called Scottish Homes, I think it was originally, and this was all part when we were part of Europe, part of the EU, and there was a whole lot of legislation around saying, well, how can you do that? These are huge public assets, which essentially you're taking out of the public domain and putting into a, you know, pseudo sort of private kind of space. And the idea was they would have all these housing associations which had local people living on the board and be much more democratic. Unfortunately, that model didn't work. And now you've got this group called the Weekly Group, whose CEO is paid over £200,000, I think. And I'm not, you know, housing is a problem everywhere. But they used to give more money to, you know, like community organisations and things like that. But now they have a huge office in the centre of Glasgow. They buy up other little housing associations, take them over, and it feels just very much like a, you know, another corporate entity. They were taken to this. There's appeal to the Scottish Government by there's a place in Mary Hill, which is kind of north of Glasgow, where there are these big high flats, and the Weekly Group wanted to knock them all down, get people out there so they could basically make more money with nicer, charge higher rents. But the people took them to court. There was a very strong community housing activist group there, and they were able to stop that and say, no, we don't want this. We're not going to be, if you knock these houses down, we're not going to get back into this area. So you're essentially using that kind of urban planning as a way to gentrify and to move people away. And we've had a lot of gentrification happen across the city, some of it linked to things like the Commonwealth Games and these kind of ideas of the city about attracting big events. And basically, it's Glasgow, I know this will make you laugh, but it kind of sees itself as the Barcelona. It wants to be the Barcelona of the, you know, because that was the model. It was like, invite people here. You can get the best breakfast and, you know, the best breakfast in Scotland. And it was all about events. And I mean, there are, as you can hopefully see, a lot of positive things about Glasgow. The music scene in Glasgow, you know, is, you know, traditionally seen as live music and various different things about it. And there is a cultural vibe to it. But that commercialisation of that, and that the amount of hotels that have been built here, you've got housing crisis, and the amount of money spent on more hotels. They've also got an economic, what do they call it, quarter. They've got a kind of where they've paid Lloyds Bank £12 million as a sweetener to build their kind of European financial district over on the other side of the Clyde. So it's a very neoliberal city on one level, which is a lot of the people still want to be part of that radical history. And you can kind of see that. And I would say places like Kingsway are indicative of that, the grassroots in Glasgow that still wants to be connected, wants to be seen. You know, old Robert Burns, the poet, says, you know, what's the quote about? I know I was going to say a man's for all that, but it's not that. If brothers be, the concept that we're all in Scottish thing, Jock Tamson's bairns. So the idea that there's a kind of humanity, a shared humanity. So there's that slightly mythical in Scotland, but it's also true because we've seen it in our own eyes.
I was glad. So for those that came on the little kind of Glasgow University tour, we kind of spoke a bit about Glasgow kind of being viewed as this kind of like socialist city in the 60s and 70s, and particularly in the 80s with Margaret Thatcher, and the policies that they implemented was basically to isolate the city as much as they could. Also through funding streams to build these new towns outside the city and move the people who could afford to move, who had skills in the workplace, who weren't too sick to work. So they kind of got isolated and held back in the city, where these other people moved out to the sort of suburbs. Again, it's happened in lots of cities. This kind of hollowing out of the kind of socialist working class of kind of Glasgow and left them with very little. But then they tried to fill that space with commerce and this kind of neoliberal view, like if you build it, they will come kind of model. So the city no longer has like housing in the centre the way it used to. It's got shopping malls and banking and, you know, hotels for like the COP. When the COP was here a few years ago, a lot of those hotels were built for people to come to COP. We mentioned like the student body, all of the student accommodation that's being built in the city for all the bits that basically the offices that nobody wants to go to anymore since COVID. They can't afford to run these big offices, so they're knocking them down, selling them to private investment firms, to Chinese firms to come in, Saudi firms to build these student accommodation for Chinese students to come and pay the university to keep me in a job. And, you know, so, but I suppose, so that's the downside. The positive side is that, yeah, there's this sort of community, local sort of spirit that happens again in lots of different cities, that people have tried to rise up and form their own sense of what this kind of city means through the art scene, through the music scene, through the kind of activist sort of scene, which is still there. But like most people were kind of weighed down by this kind of very neoliberal commercial view of what the city should be and what success is for this city. So success, like most places, is economic growth. What companies are selling things so Barclays, are they here? That's a marker of success for Glasgow City Council and its economic strategy. So the work that we're trying to do here in PHNM Scotland, linking in with all these different organisations, is trying again change that narrative. We talked yesterday about reclaiming the narrative. So yeah, not to leave on a negative. This is why we do what we do. You know, this is a city that's got a history of being kind of pushed down and downgraded and viewed as being a problem to other parts, particularly parts of power in the UK.
Yeah.
But it is trying to fight back and always has tried to fight back.
So it's this Red Clydeside was one of the things, you know, we went from the kind of rent strikes back in the kind of 1930s, where and before it was
1919 for the George
the original kind of rent strikes, and when they had the army come to like a Tiananmen Square, basically, kind of thing in George Square. And that was, you know, that was again Mary Barber and a lot of women involved in that, because the men were all fighting the war, and the landlords put all the rents up, and then the people kind of revolted against that. Then up to the 70s there was a thing called Red Clydeside, and they had a working where in the shipyards the workers basically took over to try and, you know, stop their jobs being lost. And there's a guy called Jimmy Reid who, you know, was a very revered figure giving those kind of speeches. Yeah, so this, and then they had this thing called Glasgow Smiles Better, that was the kind of real start of, you know, kind of the neoliberalisation of the city, and it had a smiley kind of, you know, wee smiley cartoon character.
So people see, if you're on the underground, there's a sort of a version of that called Glasgow. Again, it's a very commercial use of taking one of the parks and putting lights on. It's fun to go look at. I mean, it's ridiculously expensive. If you're a local resident, you can get free tickets for like the first day. But beyond that, yeah, it's this kind of, you'll see this kind of yellow figure, sort of smiley face. And that's kind of way of commercializing that, but having this kind of brand. And so one of the reports that we did that people might have seen at the weekend, we used that and changed it to Glasgow's health map as well. Yeah.
So one of the things I think we'd love to do from the People's Health Movement is have a much better knowledge of what it's like on the ground in the cities that you're in and the communities that you're in, and try and grow that commonality and share that kind of knowledge. Sorry, we're gonna.
Yeah, I was going to do some questions and maybe like I'm part of this third sector association that is based in Bologna, and we do similar work in specifically to neighborhoods that had been previously mapped with a map that is similar to the one that you can see there. So connecting the health indicators and the social indicators, and we selected 2 neighborhoods that are the most like affected by inequalities, and we do similar activities, health promotion activities. Well, I won't go into detail about it. We did something similar to to evaluate the things, but we used the concept of cuerpo territorio that comes from the Latin American context, and so to understand like how the bodies of people are also influenced by the environment. And I have lots of questions on this as well. I'll talk with you later. And yes, we also like are funded. We are funded sometimes by the city council, but I think like these health community activities and like in general, the community activities are the ones that are less finances by the health system in our neighborhood. But what we do is that we compensate our funding doing research action projects with the healthcare services, and that also gives us the opportunity of being critical, because they'll call us because there's a problem and they don't know how to solve it. And so we have the opportunity of saying, yeah, you're wondering why people with a migratory background aren't coming to your service, but you don't have translators in your healthcare service. So like that, and we have the opportunity to do that. I had a few questions like regarding what you were talking about before. Like lived experience, is it included? Well, one, I wanted to ask if there's some examples that you could give of projects that they did with people experiencing addiction, if you had some examples of that, and if people with lived experience are included within the management and also the thinking of healthcare services. Like we're working on a few projects of involving peaceful workers in Italy, and so I know that the UK in general, and I think Scotland even more has this sort of experience. And then I was wondering, like here you can see a little bit the relationship with the primary healthcare department, but I was wondering like if you have connections with the primary healthcare department and the public health sector and how that works. And yes.
So to answer that kind of question, this process of co-production, I mean, I could have shown you lots and lots of different kind of things, and I would be very keen to try and put something together which helps to kind of navigate what is quite a kind of complex. But what they brought in this kind of concept called co-production, which was really a base around those kind of principles, which was to try and essentially kind of level the power of the playing field between the different kind of corporate organisations and people with lived experience. And out of that, so there's two. There's the Scottish. There's two consortiums. One is about addiction recovery, and one is about recovery from mental health. Can you remember the names off the top of your head? Because I get them mixed up. But basically, Scottish Recovery Consortium, I think, is one of them, and the Scottish. So basically, those organisations are kind of arm's length with funding, and they organise kind of big events, and they do take a lot of leadership and vision from people with lived experience. So those are good. I would say they are good examples. Mm-hmm. Like everything, things can be better. Things can, often maybe people will have a different point of view, so they don't. It's very difficult to represent everybody from those kind of conditions. But those are one of the kind of organisations I would say is worth thinking about and talking about.
The other one's Scottish Recovery Network.
Scottish Recovery Network.
I mean, it's really hard to tell them apart because it's the same name.
Yeah. So the Scottish Recovery Consortium.
Okay.
I think that's the addiction one, and the Scottish Recovery Network is the mental health one. Okay, so that's the two. This organisation here, it's called Gal Gael. So that's like a Gaelic name. And when you were asking what people put in place for people suffering addictions and things like that, so this originally, again, we're all talking probably about 20, 25 years old.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things was like the post-New Labour kind of government. You had that period of the Conservative government, and when they got replaced by New Labour, there was, I guess, a sense of money for inequality and trying to tackle particularly early years and, you know, substance use issues. So a lot of things kind of started in the late 90s, early 2000s in Scotland.
So this was the concept of this, and you'll see, you know, this is the current kind of Instagram. The you know, part of, I think they're part of La Via Campesina. We've just done a land moot with them, which is all, you know, understanding, you know, connection to the land, etc. One of my favourite projects they did was they created the Free State of Govan when COP26. So I've got my passport from the Free State of Govan, and you can come along. So they, you know, so they created their own identity. The start of this was linked into shipbuilding skills, because a lot of the people they were finding with alcoholism, etc., was because they lost their jobs. So it was to create a space back, and they made these links with a. They made these links with the fact that there was a process of colonisation and enclosure called the clearances. Okay, and there's a book called the Poor Had No Lawyers, right? So what happened was basically the common grazing land, which was shared, basically the elites in Scotland went out, they took a map and they would come up and they would go to Edinburgh and say, we own this land. And then they would go up and say, and they would clear all the people off it that lived there. So it's a process called clearances. And a lot of those people then ended up coming from the Highlands into Glasgow, and then often from Glasgow to places like Canada, to the States and things like that, to then go and colonise. That's why you've got this big kind of Scottish diaspora in different places, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So you can see that they're still, you know, connected into the shipbuilding as well as other kind of work. And now they've often this kind of they use the kind of boat designs which were used by many of the kind of Highlanders that sailed to the city. And you know, we've had a Akilfemi, is that how you pronounce it? He's a brilliant African Indian philosopher. Bayou Akilfemi, do you know who I'm talking about? Anyway, if you don't know him, you're going to like him. He's good. But so they've had these they have a really multicultural element, and every Thursday night they have a meal that you can just turn up, and everybody kind of sits around. They can fire outside, and it's, you know, it is a really, really great place. But it's, so that would be something that maybe if we're looking at about twinning or going back or making more connections between our different cities and our different community groups, I'd love Galhiel to be involved. In fact, David was meant to be able to come along for that, but again, we're so busy with that.
Just I think on YouTube, the video about the Colin McLeod, is that his name? Is on YouTube. It's a really good documentary. Right. I think it's called The Birdman of Pollock.
Aye, so I'm not giving you the full history of this. So basically,
to be here a while.
So basically, if you notice in Glasgow, there's a lot of motorways that you know, basically the city was destroyed by motorways that went right the way through it. And there was a place called Pollock, which is Pollock Country Park, which sits out in the kind of south of the city, where the Burrell collection is. So there's a big museum there that was given for money from a coloniser that had made all the money all over the world and stole art off people, and then left money to make a museum. But in this big country park, they wanted to put a motorway through it, and people protested. They took to the trees and they did this thing. And out of that, Pollock, Pollock State, Galhiel came from those groups of protesters. And Jehan McLeod was Colin's wife, who still is there and is quite an amazing person. So when you come back next time, we'll have all these people come to visit you. But that was definitely a place we'd have liked to take you.